Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight we enter the quiet world of Miss Marple in the Clue, folded into the theatre program. A death interrupts the evening's play. A folded program hides a silent secret, and one question lingers. Who wanted the truth concealed? Are you listening in the hush of night or over morning tea? Let us know below. Now, light a candle, sit back, and let the mystery begin. Where are you listening from tonight? The warm voice of the narrator might ask. But in truth, the story begins in the small town of Nether Upton, a place that prided itself on being both genteel and uneventful. That evening, however, uneventfulness was about to vanish with the raising of a velvet curtain. The local dramatic society was performing The Lady's Revenge, a play whose title seemed designed to titillate rather than edify. The church vicar sat in the front row, firmly clutching his program, while matrons with lorgnettes eyed the stage with high expectations. And in row F, 3 seats from the aisle, sat Miss Jane Marple, a pale blue shawl drawn neatly about her shoulders, her eyes sharper than the footlights. It was halfway through the second act when the trouble began. A sharp cry, quickly muffled, rose above the stage dialogue. At first, the audience thought it was part of the play, for the actors froze convincingly. But when the leading man stumbled and a figure collapsed in the stalls, reality struck. The curtain dropped hastily. A whisper ran through the hall like a stiff draft. Someone had died. The victim was Mr. Hubert Colley, a retired solicitor known for his neat bow ties and his rather less neat habit of arguing over bills. He was slumped in his seat, his theatre program folded tightly in one hand. A doctor in the audience rushed to his side, only to shake his head grimly. "Natural causes, perhaps," murmured the vicar, but Miss Marple's eyes had fixed upon the tightly folded program. Strange, she thought, how a man would grip paper so firmly, even in his last moments. Stranger still, a corner of the program seemed deliberately tucked, as though hiding something within. Outside, gossip had already begun its inevitable spread. Mrs. Phelps declared she had seen Mr. Colley whispering angrily with a younger man before the performance. Mr. Briggs insisted he had heard Colley mutter about a scandal that would ruin them all. Yet it was Miss Marple who noticed the quieter details. The young usher, pale and trembling, avoided looking at the corpse. The widow, seated 2 rows behind, gave a little sigh that seemed more relieved than shocked. And on the balcony, someone slipped quickly out into the night before anyone thought to ask their name. The police were summoned, of course, but by the time Inspector Cray arrived, the theatre buzzed with more theories than facts. Heart failure, I dare say, he told Miss Marple politely, though his tone made clear he thought she was a harmless spinster. But Miss Marple only smiled. "It does look so, Inspector." And yet she glanced once more at the folded program still clutched in the dead man's hand. Her voice dropped, almost conspiratorial, as though speaking to an unseen listener. "Stay with us until the end. Only then will the truth be revealed." And with that, a muffled gasp rippled through the crowd. The folded theatre program had fallen open at last, revealing inside not notes about the play, but a torn fragment of a letter, smeared with what appeared to be fresh ink and the single word, murder. Theatre doors have a curious way of holding secrets. Long after the performance was abandoned, small knots of villagers gathered in the vestibule, their voices lowered but their words carrying. The air was thick with perfume, pipe smoke, and the unmistakable spice of scandal. "Tragic, simply tragic," declared Mrs. Phelps, clutching her fox fur stole as though Hubert Colley's death might spread contagion. "Though between you and me, it was bound to happen sooner or later. The man lived on nerves and litigation." "Litigation?" asked Mr. Briggs, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "I heard it was something more dramatic." He'd been seen in the company of that actress from the 3rd row, the one with the, well, you know, He gave a discreet cough. The whispers thickened, bouncing off the vestibule's tiled walls like stray echoes. But while others exchanged half-truths and suppositions, Miss Marple stood quietly at the margin, a modest figure with her shawl drawn tightly about her. She listened not to the words, so much as to the tones beneath them. People revealed more in what they tried not to say. The usher, a pale youth with nervous hands, hovered near the cloakroom. Miss Marple watched him as he adjusted his tie, then let it fall back again. His eyes darted every time the folded program was mentioned. She approached gently, as was her way. "A most unfortunate evening," she murmured. "You must be quite shaken." The boy started. "Yes, miss. Terrible thing. Just dreadful." "Mr. Colley seemed distressed earlier, did he not?" "I fancy seeing you show him to his seat." The usher hesitated. His fingers twisted against the lapel of his uniform. Only he asked for an aisle seat, though his ticket was for row F. He said he needed to be near the door. Odd, I thought. But then, well, you can't say no to a man like Mr. Colley, can you? Miss Marple's eyes softened. It can be very hard to say no. Did anyone speak with him then? The boy's lips parted as though to answer, but at that moment Inspector Cray strode through the vestibule, bringing with him a gust of cold night air and the smell of rain on cobblestones. "Right, everyone," Cray announced briskly. "If you've no business here, kindly go home. There's nothing to see now. The doctor says heart failure, and that's the end of it." The crowd shifted uneasily, but there was relief in their faces. Heart failure was safe. Heart failure asked for no awkward questions. Miss Marple did not look relieved. Her eyes had rested once more on the folded program, now tucked carefully into the inspector's case. The fragment of letter with its dark, blotted word haunted her thoughts. People who died naturally did not usually leave behind messages that shouted murder. Still, she remained outwardly serene. "Of course, Inspector," she said kindly. "Though I wonder if Mr. Colley's last act might deserve a little curiosity. After all, one does not fold a program in such a way without purpose. I myself use corners of paper for all manner of reminders, what jam to buy and whom to call upon after tea." Cray gave a tolerant smile. "Indeed, Miss Marple. But this is not the grocer's list." The man was ill. Likely fancied himself in some melodrama after watching that nonsense on stage. The villagers chuckled nervously at his dismissal, grateful for any explanation that returned them to the ordinary. Yet Miss Marple noticed the usher again, shifting from foot to foot as though he longed to speak but feared the inspector's presence. She stepped away politely, joining the gossiping cluster near the cloakroom. Mrs. Phelps leaned in confidentially. "Did you see Mrs. Colley? Left before anyone thought to summon her. Practically fled, she did. And not a tear in sight." "Not a tear," echoed Mr. Briggs, shaking his head. Almost as if she expected it. Miss Marple tilted her head. Widows, in her experience, often displayed relief as much as grief, especially if married to difficult men. Yet the timing of Mrs. Colley's departure seemed curiously prompt. A sharp exclamation cut across the murmurs. One of the amateur actors, still in stage makeup, had joined the vestibule. His voice was low but urgent. "I saw him," he said, just before the second act. Colley was speaking with a stranger in the wings, a tall fellow in a brown overcoat. Not from the village, I'll wager. The crowd inhaled collectively, as though the appearance of an unknown man were more shocking than the death itself. "Did you hear what was said?" Miss Marple asked gently. The actor frowned, smudging rouge across his cheek. Couldn't catch the words. Only saw the fellow press something into Colley's hand. A slip of paper, I think. Miss Marple folded her hands together. A slip of paper, eyes. That would explain the folded program and the hidden fragment of letter. Colley had been given something, and in his final moments, he had tried to preserve it. She glanced at Inspector Cray. But the inspector was already ushering people out into the rain, eager to close the book on what he saw as a simple collapse. The vestibule grew emptier, shadows stretching across the tiles. Miss Marple moved towards the door, her steps measured and thoughtful. She paused only once, as though to herself, yet in a voice that carried just enough for the departing villagers to hear. Murder has a way of hiding in plain sight. One only needs to listen closely. The usher froze at her words, his hands suddenly stiff at his sides. His silence told her more than any confession. Miss Marple offered him a mild, grandmotherly smile. "I expect I shall see you again very soon." As the theatre doors closed behind her and the rain fell steadily onto Nether Upton's cobbles, the sense of calm, ordinary life seemed to tremble. For in the shadows across the street, a tall man in a brown overcoat was watching, waiting, and then vanished into the night. Morning in Nether Upton had a way of looking deceptively peaceful. The cottages with their lace curtains and well-trimmed hedges seemed entirely removed from the events of the previous night. Yet under the calm surface, the village was buzzing. A death in the theatre was not something easily ignored. By mid-morning, the gossip had reached every kitchen and shop counter. Mrs. Phelps, ever industrious in spreading news, announced to the baker that Hubert Colley had been poisoned. Mr. Briggs, while buying his tobacco, insisted it was a quarrel turned violent. Even the milkman claimed he had seen strangers loitering about, though none could agree on what these strangers looked like. Miss Marple, however, did not linger over bread rolls or tobacco. She walked briskly down the lane toward the Colley residence, her mind quietly weaving together last night's observations. The widow's sudden departure troubled her most of all. A wife who left so quickly, without a single inquiry after her husband, must either have known more than she wished to admit, or feared more than she dared to face. The Colley home stood at the edge of town, a neat red brick house with ivy climbing the front. A maid opened the door, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "Mrs. Colley is not receiving," she said quickly, attempting to close the door again. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "Do be kind, my dear. I've brought my condolences, nothing more. A widow should not be left to silence in such a time." The maid hesitated, then reluctantly stepped aside. Inside, the house was dim, blinds drawn against the morning sun. The sitting room bore the stiffness of a place arranged for appearances, with a polished table, porcelain figurines, and no sign of use. Mrs. Colley sat in a high-backed chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was younger than many had remembered, perhaps 45, her black dress already in place, though the morning papers had barely carried word of her husband's death. "Mrs. Colley," Miss Marple began gently, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I thought perhaps you might like a friendly ear." The widow's lips curved faintly, though no warmth touched her eyes. "You are kind, Miss Marple, but I have very little to say." There was silence then, heavy and deliberate. Miss Marple filled it with a soft observation. It was such a shock to us all, to be taken ill so suddenly and in a crowded theatre. The widow's eyes flickered. "Illness comes for us all. Hubert was never a well man, a weak heart, perhaps. So the doctor always said." Her tone was smooth and rehearsed. Too smooth, Miss Marple thought, like a line repeated until it felt safe. "I noticed," Miss Marple continued casually, "that you left the theatre rather quickly last night, before even the inspector arrived." A pause. Mrs. Colley's hands tightened in her lap. "I did not wish to create a scene. One must keep one's composure." Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. "Indeed, though most wives I have known cannot be persuaded from their husband's side, however dreadful the sight. Yours was a rare restraint." The widow turned her head toward the curtained window, saying nothing. Miss Marple let the silence linger before adding gently, "And yet, I dare say, Hubert was not always the easiest man to live with." This time the faintest quiver passed across Mrs. Colley's face. "You cannot imagine," she whispered. Then she caught herself, straightening quickly. But of course, none of that matters now. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright but kind. "On the contrary, my dear, it often matters very much." The maid reappeared, flustered as though to end the conversation. Miss Marple rose with polite words of farewell. "Thank you for receiving me. If ever you wish to speak, you know where I may be found." As she stepped out into the street, Miss Marple's mind replayed the encounter. Mrs. Colley's composure had been too perfect, her answers too prepared. More telling than words, however, was the slip. You cannot imagine. That brief confession revealed volumes of discontent. Down the lane, Miss Marple was stopped by the grocer's wife, who leaned out of her doorway with an eager expression. "Have you heard, Miss Marple? They say Mr. Colley wrote a letter before he died, naming names, and the police have it locked away." "People do enjoy embellishing," Miss Marple said mildly. Yet she thought at once of the torn fragment tucked into the program. It was not a full letter, perhaps, but it carried meaning all the same. She continued on, pausing near the churchyard gate where Inspector Cray stood speaking with one of his constables. His face bore the weary look of a man who longed to return to ordinary duty. "Ah, Miss Marple," he greeted with forced cheer. "I trust Mrs. Colley is bearing up." "As best she can," Miss Marple replied, though her composure seems rather studied. Cray gave a short laugh. "She's a solicitor's wife. They spend half their lives rehearsing appearances. Truth is, I doubt there's much here for us. The doctor's certain of natural causes." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And the fragment of paper, Inspector? The one that spoke of murder?" Cray frowned. "Likely some scribble from one of his cases. Solicitors write murder in margins all the time. Murder of a contract, murder of an argument. Lawyers have their own language." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed softly, "though words have a curious way of meaning more than we suppose." The constable interrupted with a small note. "Sir, we've traced the coat. Brown overcoat, as described. Belongs to a lodger at the King's Arms Inn." At this, Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A stranger in the village was never truly a stranger. There was always a reason for being in Nether Upton, and seldom a harmless one. Inspector Cray waved it off. "Likely a travelling salesman. I'll speak with him later." Miss Marple gave her gentle smile once more, but as she walked away, she murmured quietly, almost to herself, yet with the firmness of certainty. The widow's silence speaks louder than any words, and strangers rarely appear without purpose. Behind her, the bells of the church tolled the hour. In Nether Upton, ordinary life marched on, but the shadow of last night's theatre lingered dark, whispering, and unresolved. The King's Arms was not the sort of inn that attracted much outside interest. Its timbered walls and smoky hearth catered more to local farmers than to travellers from afar. Yet that morning, when Miss Marple made her way discreetly through the doorway, the atmosphere hummed with speculation. At the bar, the innkeeper's wife, Mrs. Brand, was already recounting her version of events to a pair of eager listeners. Tall as a lamp-post he was, and quiet with it. He asked for a room near the back and kept to himself. Paid in crisp notes, too. You don't see many of those in Nether Upton. Miss Marple ordered a modest pot of tea and listened. The art of listening, she often reflected, was rather like darning stockings. Small holes of truth revealed themselves if you were patient with the pattern. She did not have long to wait. The stranger himself appeared at the stairwell, stooping slightly beneath the low ceiling. He wore the same brown overcoat described at the theatre, its collar turned up as though against more than the morning chill. His face was lean, with shadows beneath the eyes, the sort of face that carried worry like a permanent imprint. Conversation faltered as he crossed the room. He nodded politely but said nothing, seating himself in the far corner. Miss Marple, feigning absorption in her teacup, observed every detail. His boots were clean, too clean for country lanes. His hands, when he set them on the table, bore faint ink stains, not the hands of a labourer, but of a man accustomed to writing. Inspector Cray arrived soon after, his broad frame filling the doorway. He wasted no time, striding directly to the stranger's table. "Name?" he demanded. The man looked up calmly. "Graham Linton. I'm a commercial clerk. London. Purpose of visit? Rest, doctor's orders. I've been ill." His voice was even, yet a trace of tension edged the words. Cray leaned in slightly. "You were seen speaking with Mr. Hubert Colley last night." "In the wings of the theatre." Linton's brows lifted in mild surprise. "Yes. He sought me out. He said he recognized me from chambers in Lincoln's Inn some years ago. I hardly remembered him." "Hardly remembered," Cray repeated dryly. "And yet you pressed something into his hand." A pause. Linton's gaze flickered briefly toward the hearth before returning to the inspector. A note. Merely directions. I had promised to send him some papers he was interested in. Nothing of consequence. Miss Marple, listening from her corner, thought how very rarely people told the truth in such simple terms. There was always a small embellishment, a detail too neat. Directions, she suspected, were the least of it. Cray frowned. "We found part of that note. It contained one word. Murder. Care to explain?" Linton stiffened. "A misunderstanding. It referred to a case Colley once handled. A trial transcript, I believe. He was fond of dramatics and liked to keep old fragments. He insisted on the word being written plainly. I cannot say why." The inn's patrons leaned closer, eager for scandal. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, though her mind raced. A man of business, ink on his fingers, suddenly appearing in Nether Upton with a word like murder on his paper. It was all too conveniently explained. Cray straightened. "You'll remain in town until further notice?" Linton inclined his head with cool politeness. "Of course, Inspector. I have no reason to flee." But Miss Marple noticed the tightening of his jaw, the way his hand gripped the chair arm a moment too long. A harmless guest would not display such hidden strain. When Cray departed, leaving the room buzzing, Miss Marple made her own quiet approach. She had a talent for seeming invisible until she wished otherwise. "Forgive me," she said gently, standing beside his table, "but I could not help overhearing. It must be trying to be suspected when one has only come for rest." Linton regarded her cautiously. "Indeed, madam. The inspector has his duties. I have nothing to conceal." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One hopes so, though I have often found that those who say they have nothing to conceal usually have something, if only a trifle. A misplaced friendship, an indiscreet letter, perhaps." His eyes narrowed just for a heartbeat before he masked the reaction. "You are very shrewd, Mrs. Marple. Jane Marple. From St. Mary Mead." He inclined his head. "Then, Miss Marple, I shall reassure you. My visit here is purely innocent." She nodded kindly. "I'm certain you believe it." And with that, she returned to her seat, leaving him to his solitary cup of coffee. Outside, the rain had ceased, but clouds still hung low over Nether Upton. As Miss Marple stepped into the street, she passed Mrs. Phelps hurrying by with news fresh from the butcher's boy. "They say the widow's maid saw Mr. Colley with a sealed envelope yesterday afternoon," Mrs. Phelps whispered, breathlessly, "and it's gone missing now." Miss Marple walked on, her mind gathering threads. A missing envelope, a folded program, a stranger with ink-stained hands. Each piece she knew belonged to a pattern, yet invisible. She paused at the corner, glancing back toward the inn. Graham Linton sat by the window now, staring out with an intensity that suggested far more than rest. and as she watched, he slipped something from his pocket, a small folded slip of paper, quickly concealed again. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet certainty. Whatever the inspector might say, this man had not come to Nether Upton by accident, and somewhere within that vanished envelope lay the truth that would unravel the whole affair. The rhythm of village life carried on, as it always does, but with every hour the death of Hubert Colley seemed less like a misfortune and more like the opening of a locked drawer. Something hidden had spilled out, and no one could push it back in. By the following afternoon, the matter of the missing envelope was on everyone's lips. The butcher's boy had claimed the maid mentioned it. The maid insisted she had only hinted at it, and Mrs. Phelps swore blind that she had seen Mr. Colley carry it in his coat pocket on the very day he died. Cream paper, she declared in the grocer's shop, with a black seal. It looked important. Legal, I'd say. And now gone. Miss Marple listened, as she so often did, without appearing to listen at all. She stood in the shop choosing tea biscuits while her mind turned the possibilities over with quiet precision. A sealed envelope of cream paper, black seal. Something official. Something Colley clearly valued, and now vanished. When she left the grocer's, she took the long way round toward the Colley house. A hedge sparrow chattered from the garden wall as she paused outside. Mrs. Colley's maid was hanging laundry, her movements quick and nervous, as though eager to return indoors. "A sad business," Miss Marple remarked, leaning lightly on the gate. The maid gave a start. "Yes, miss. Terribly sad. They say Mr. Colley had an envelope the day he died. Do you know what became of it?" The girl shook her head quickly, eyes wide. "I never saw such a thing." But Miss Marple noticed the way her hands fumbled with the peg basket, dropping 2 pegs before she steadied herself. Lies, Miss Marple knew, were rarely told with perfect composure. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said kindly, "you were told not to mention it. Servants are often given burdens they do not deserve." The girl swallowed, her lips parting as though to speak. But just then, Mrs. Colley's sharp voice called from within. The maid turned hastily, muttering, "I've said nothing, miss, truly nothing," before scurrying back to the house. Miss Marple stood a moment longer, her eyes on the laundry flapping in the wind. Sheets and pillowcases revealed nothing, yet she suspected the silence inside that house was more telling than any confession. Later that day, Inspector Cray sought her out, finding her seated in the tea shop with a slice of seed cake. He lowered his voice as he slid into the chair opposite. "There's talk of a missing envelope," he said bluntly. "Talk often has roots." Inspector Miss Marple replied, breaking her cake neatly. "One rarely sees smoke without a small fire beneath." Cray frowned. If such an envelope exists, it could explain the folded paper in Colley's program. Perhaps the fragment was torn from it. Miss Marple nodded gently. "And the question, of course, is who took it after his death?" "Or before," Cray muttered darkly. "The maid swears she saw nothing, but I've long believed servants see far more than they admit." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed, "but they also fear losing their places, and fear is a most persuasive silencer." Cray drummed his fingers on the table. "The widow claims ignorance, naturally. But I've asked my constable to search for the study. If Colley kept anything of value, it may yet turn up." As he rose to go, Miss Marple's voice stopped him. "Inspector, may I ask about the stranger? Mr. Graham Linton?" Cray sighed. "Still at the King's Arms. Claims he has letters of business with Colley, but shows nothing. He's calm enough, but I don't like his manner." "Calmness," Miss Marple said softly, "is sometimes the most deliberate disguise." That evening, Miss Marple passed the inn again. The windows glowed faintly with lamplight, and inside she saw Linton at the table, writing swiftly on a slip of paper. When the innkeeper approached, he folded it away with almost guilty haste. She stepped inside with her usual unassuming air. "Good evening, Mr. Linton. You must find Nether Upton a curious place, with everyone so eager to speculate." Linton looked up, his expression controlled. "Indeed, Miss Marple, a man can hardly draw breath without it being reported to the baker." "Ah, but breath can be quite revealing," she said mildly. "It shows whether one is troubled or afraid, or perhaps planning something." His jaw tightened. "You have a lively imagination, madam." "Only a lively memory," she replied. "One sees a good many patterns in human behavior after a while. Men clutching papers, women keeping secrets, maids dropping pegs. It all forms a rather curious picture." Linton said nothing, only offered a tight smile before excusing himself. Miss Marple lingered at the bar, ordering a half-cup of sherry. As she sipped, Mrs. Brant, the innkeeper's wife, sidled close. "Strange fellow, that one," she whispered. "Never locks his door, but always keeps his papers on his person. Sleep with them under his pillow, I dare say." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Papers, you say?" Mrs. Brant nodded vigorously. "Carries them everywhere. If there was an envelope, miss, I'd wager he has it now." Miss Marple left soon after, stepping into the cool evening. The cobbled streets were quiet, the lamps just being lit. She paused beneath one of them, gazing back toward the inn where shadows shifted in the upper windows. The missing envelope, the stranger with ink-stained hands, and the widow's silence, all the threads were tightening. And Miss Marple, with her patient eye for small details, knew it was only a matter of time before the pattern revealed itself. She walked home slowly, her shawl drawn close, murmuring in the hush of twilight. A letter is rarely lost. It always finds its way into the wrong hands. The theatre had reopened sooner than anyone expected. It was a stubbornness born less of courage than of pride. The dramatic society would not have Nether Upton believe that one death, however unfortunate, could close their show. By the second evening, the posters were back on the notice boards, the velvet curtains hung once more, and tickets were being quietly sold at the greengrocer's counter. Yet beneath the determined bustle, unease lingered. People whispered of Hubert Colley's sudden collapse and the folded program with its ominous message. Still, curiosity proved stronger than fear, and when the lamps were lit on the second night, the hall filled nearly as before. The villagers, it seemed, could not resist returning to the very place where death had struck. Miss Marple was among them, seated a little farther back this time. Her presence surprised no one. She had the reputation of attending nearly everything in Nether Upton. But while others came for diversion, Miss Marple's pale blue eyes studied the audience as closely as the stage. The widow, Mrs. Colley, was there too, dressed in sombre black. She had insisted upon attending, a gesture some considered brave, others improper. She sat rigidly, her face unreadable as the performance began. Near the aisle, Inspector Cray kept watch with obvious suspicion, though his heavy frame looked ill at ease in the narrow theatre chair. And in the back corner, partly hidden by shadows, Graham Linton occupied the same seat as the night before. He appeared calm, his overcoat folded neatly on his knees, but Miss Marple noticed the way his eyes shifted frequently, not toward the stage, but toward the audience. He seemed less a spectator than a man waiting for something to occur. The first act passed without incident, though the actors performed stiffly, their lines delivered with more nervousness than conviction. But midway through the second act, almost at the same point as Colley's collapse, commotion stirred again. This time it was not death, but violence. A sudden cry rang out from the wings. The performance halted, actors freezing mid-line. Inspector Cray leapt from his seat, and the audience murmured in dread. Within moments, the curtain was lowered hastily, just as it had been before. Miss Marple rose, calm but purposeful, and joined the rush toward the backstage door. Inside, the scene was confusing. The young usher, pale as chalk, stood, clutching his arm where blood oozed from a shallow gash. A stage prop, a decorative sword, lay on the floor, its tip stained. "He came at me," the boy cried, trembling. Someone pushed it into my hand and tried to force me and tried to make me. His voice broke. "Who did this?" demanded Cray, his face thunderous. The boy looked around wildly. "I don't know. It was dark, sir. Someone was behind me. I swear." The actors gathered in anxious clusters, voices rising in frightened speculation. Another attack, just like last night. Who would do such a thing? Miss Marple knelt beside the boy, her manner soothing. "There now, you're safe. A scratch only, though frightening, I'm sure. Tell me, did you see anything at all? A sleeve? A hand?" The boy shook his head desperately. Only it smelled of ink, a sharp smell like from a spilled bottle. Miss Marple's eyes flickered, though her expression remained mild. Ink. She thought at once of Graham Linton, the stranger with the stained fingers. Inspector Cray barked orders, sending the constable to search the wings. The assailant must be nearby. No one leaves this theatre. But as the search commenced, Linton was nowhere to be found. His seat stood empty, his overcoat gone. The audience, now in full uproar, pressed toward the exits despite Cray's shouts. The widow slipped quickly away amid the confusion, her face as unreadable as before. When at last the hall was cleared and the usher tended, Cray paced furiously. First a death, now an attack. I'll have the whole place locked if need be. Miss Marple remained calm, her voice thoughtful. Locks, Inspector, are of little use when the key is already in someone's hand. It's better to observe who leaves too quickly and who lingers too long. Cray shot her a look of irritation, but she only smiled, her shawl gathered neatly around her shoulders. As she left the theatre, Miss Marple reflected on the strange symmetry of events. 2 nights, 2 disturbances, both at the same moment in the play. One man dead, another nearly forced into violence. It could hardly be a coincidence. She paused at the corner of the square, her eyes narrowing at the sight of footprints in the soft earth leading away from the side door. They were long strides, hastily made, and beside them, fainter but distinct, was the impression of a woman's smaller shoes walking quickly in the same direction. The night air was still, the lamps casting long shadows on the cobbles. Somewhere in the darkness, Graham Linton had vanished, and perhaps, Miss Marple thought, he had not vanished alone. She murmured softly, as though confiding in an unseen listener. Patterns repeat themselves for a reason, and when they do, one must ask who is writing the script. The theatre behind her stood silent once more, its velvet curtains hiding secrets that refused to stay buried. The night pressed close to Nether Upton as the audience dispersed from the theatre, their chatter a blend of fear and fascination. A drizzle had begun, soft at first, then heavier, beating against the cobblestones until the streets gleamed under the gas lamps. The sound of rain seemed to hush the village, but for Miss Marple it only sharpened her attention. She had seen those hurried footprints outside the theatre, 2 sets walking together into the dark. Drawing her shawl close, she followed the path along the lane that led toward the market square. Few would have noticed such faint traces in the rain, but Miss Marple had long since learned to read small details. The larger prints, the strangers, struck out with haste. The smaller ones, the widows, followed at a pace lighter but no less urgent. At the far end of the square, the King's Arms Inn cast its glow onto the wet pavement. Miss Marple paused beneath the archway of a shop and watched. Moments later, a tall figure in a brown overcoat appeared, slipping quickly through the inside entrance. He looked over his shoulder once, but the rain shielded Miss Marple's pale figure in the shadows. And then came Mrs. Colley. Her black veil clung to her face in the damp, her step unsteady as she crossed the square. Without hesitation, she followed Linton into the inn. Miss Marple considered this in silence. A widow who fled the theatre at the first sign of trouble, now meeting in secret with the very man the inspector distrusted most. It was a pattern no amount of coincidence could explain. She moved slowly toward the inn door, but before she reached it, a familiar voice called her name. "Miss Marple! What on earth are you doing out in this rain?" Inspector Cray emerged from the opposite street, his coat soaked, his hat pulled low. He had been sending constables to search the alleys, and now his sharp eyes caught her at once. "I might ask the same of you, Inspector," she said mildly, though her eyes flickered toward the inn. Cray followed her glance, then grunted. "So they came this way. I'll have them out there and see if their stories match." Miss Marple's hand touched his sleeve lightly. "Do take care. A hasty question can sometimes send the truth further into hiding. Best, I find, to let people speak when they think no one is listening." Cray scowled, impatient with her calmness, but he did not rush forward. Instead, he sent a constable round the back while he kept watch at the front. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air, stepped quietly inside the public room. The inn was nearly empty. A few farmers dozed over their ale. The hearth burned low, and Mrs. Brandt, the landlady, polished glasses with exaggerated slowness, clearly listening to every whisper. From beyond the door to the private parlor came the faint murmur of voices, low, urgent, and hurried. Miss Marple seated herself near the hearth, ordering a half-cup of tea she did not intend to drink. She strained her ears, catching fragments through the wooden door. Dangerous to keep. It. A man's voice. "Linton is sharp with worry. I had no choice. Hubert knew too much. A woman's voice, unmistakably Mrs. Colley. There was the scrape of a chair, then the sound of paper rustling. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. So the envelope had not vanished into thin air. It was here, in that room, passing between widow and stranger. The door creaked slightly, and she caught a glimpse of Linton standing, his back stiff, while Mrs. Colley clutched something pale in her hand. The envelope is cream-colored paper with a broken black seal. But before more could be seen, the landlady dropped her glass with a sharp crash. The voices inside stopped at once. The door opened, and Linton stepped out, eyes narrowing when he spotted Miss Marple by the fire. For a heartbeat, his expression betrayed something close to alarm. Then he inclined his head politely, forcing calm. "Miss Marple, you do choose interesting evenings." She smiled gently. "Life provides them, Mr. Linton. I merely observe." Behind him, Mrs. Colley emerged, her veil hastily lowered. She carried nothing in her hands now, though her fingers trembled as she adjusted her shawl. The atmosphere grew taut. Linton excused himself with a brief bow and strode upstairs. Mrs. Colley slipped quickly out into the rain, leaving the inn silent once more save for the fire's crackle. Miss Marple sat perfectly still, her tea cooling untouched. She had seen enough to know the envelope existed and that it carried more weight than either Linton or the widow dared admit openly. When Inspector Cray entered moments later, dripping rain from his hat, Miss Marple merely said in her quiet way, "The play continues, Inspector, but I dare say the next act will be even more revealing." Cray frowned, clearly puzzled, but before he could question her further, a shout rang out from the street. A constable had discovered something in the gutter outside. A small scrap of cream paper, torn roughly at the edge, its surface smeared with ink. On it, just legible through the damp, was a single line of writing. "They will kill again if this is known." The rain beat harder on the inn's roof as Miss Marple looked from the paper to the inspector, her voice calm but firm. "You see, it was never only one death. The curtain has not yet fallen on this affair. The discovery of the damp scrap of paper had shifted the mood of Nether Upton from curiosity to unease. One death could be dismissed as chance, a failing heart perhaps, but words like, 'They will kill again if this is known,' gave shape to something darker. The townsfolk muttered about conspiracies, old grievances, and secrets better left undisturbed. Miss Marple, however, knew that secrets rarely stayed buried. They had roots, and those roots could almost always be traced through the orderly but revealing records of a village. The following morning, she walked to St. Michael's, the parish church whose steeple overlooked the market square. The rain had passed, leaving the air damp and the paths slick with fallen leaves. Inside, the church smelled faintly of polish and old wood, the pews lined in quiet dignity. The vicar, Reverend Alton, looked up from his desk as Miss Marple entered. "Why, Miss Marple, what a surprise! You've come for the morning service." "Not today, Reverend," she said with her mild smile. "I hoped I might trouble you for a look at the parish records. I've always found them such a comfort. So many lives are carefully written down. One sees how nothing is ever truly forgotten." The vicar, though puzzled, was easily persuaded. He led her into the vestry, where heavy ledgers lay on the shelves, their bindings cracked with age. Miss Marple set to work with practiced patience, her finger trailing down lists of baptisms, marriages, and burials. She was looking not for names she knew, but for names that linked. And before long, a pattern emerged. Hubert Colley's family had lived in Nether Upton for generations. Yet in the year 1904, a curious entry appeared. A baptism recorded for one, Edmund Linton. The name tugged at her memory. Linton, the stranger now lodged at the King's Arms. She traced further. Edmund's family had left the parish abruptly 2 years later. Notes in the margin, written in a different hand, suggested emigration after the scandal. No details, of course. Vicars rarely recorded gossip, but the implication was clear enough. Miss Marple sat back, thoughtful. Sir Graham Linton was not entirely a stranger. He had roots in Nether Upton, roots carefully pruned from memory. And if Hubert Colley, solicitor by trade and meddler by habit, had discovered this link, it could explain the missing envelope and the fatal confrontation. She closed the ledger gently and turned to Reverend Alton. "It is such a blessing," she said in her kindest tones, "that your records are kept so diligently. A village without memory would be a dangerous place indeed." The Reverend, taking her remark at face value, beamed. "Yes, indeed, Miss Marple. Though between ourselves, some pages do contain more delicate histories than others." When she stepped out of the vestry, the autumn sun broke weakly through the clouds. In the square, Inspector Cray stood speaking with his constable, his expression sour. He spotted Miss Marple and strode across. "You've been at the records, I see," he said, not without irritation. "I don't suppose you found a clue to murder in the baptismal register." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, Inspector, one finds all manner of things in the parish books. Old quarrels, old disgraces. They rarely vanish entirely. And the past has a way of reaching into the present, don't you find?" Cray folded his arms. "What I find is that Graham Linton has gone missing from the inn, vanished with his papers. The landlady swears he left before dawn." "Vanished," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Then he is chasing something or fleeing it. Either way, it suggests urgency." Cray scowled. "I've sent men to the station. If he means to leave by train, we'll have him." Miss Marple thought carefully. "I doubt he will leave so soon, Inspector. Not while something he values remains here." And at that very moment, Mrs. Phelps bustled across the square, waving a handkerchief as if to summon the entire parish. "Have you heard of it? The widow has dismissed her maid this very morning, sent her away without warning, and they say the poor girl was in tears." Cray muttered an oath under his breath. "Every time I turn around, another complication. I'll have a word with the widow myself." But Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Mrs. Phelps' news. A maid dismissed suddenly often meant one thing. She had seen too much or said too much. The envelope, the whispered meeting at the inn, and the fragment of warning, it was all circling closer to the widow's door. She walked slowly back toward her cottage, her shawl snug against the damp air. As she passed the old stone wall by the churchyard, she paused, gazing at the moss-covered stones as if they were pages in a book. People believe the past is behind them, she murmured softly. But in truth, it is always beside them, waiting to be read. At her gate, she found a slip of paper pushed through the bars. The ink was smudged by rain, but the words were still legible. "Meet me at dusk by the churchyard yew. I know the truth." She read it twice, her lips tightening. Someone had chosen her as a confidant, someone who feared to speak openly. And as the church bells tolled the hour, Miss Marple knew that dusk would bring another revelation and, perhaps, another danger. The yew tree in the churchyard had stood for centuries, its dark branches twisting like old secrets across the gravestones. To villagers, it was a familiar landmark, yet at dusk it took on a more ominous air. The shadows stretched long, the stone angels looked stern, and the silence carried an expectation of revelation. Miss Marple arrived early, her small figure moving quietly among the graves. She wore her pale shawl more against the evening damp than for warmth. To the casual eye, she might have seemed like an old woman coming to pay respects. But her mind was alert, every sense tuned to the promise of the note. She waited by the yew, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a night bird. The village bell tolled 7, each stroke echoing across the still air. At last, footsteps approached, hesitant and hurried. Out of the gloom came the maid from the Colley household, her face pale, her hands clutching a small bundle. She stopped short when she saw Miss Marple, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "You got my note?" she whispered. Miss Marple inclined her head kindly. "Indeed I did, my dear. You were quite right to send it. Now tell me what weighs so heavily on you." The girl pressed the bundle into Miss Marple's hands. It was a folded apron, and hidden within lay another scrap of cream paper, torn from the missing envelope. The seal was broken, the ink blurred, but the words were chillingly clear. "The fraud cannot remain hidden. If revealed, lives will be ruined." Miss Marple studied the fragment, her expression grave. "And where did you find this?" The maid trembled. "In the study fireplace. Mrs. Colley told me to burn everything that was left on his desk the night after he died, but I couldn't bring myself to. I hid this piece away. And why come to me?" Tears welled in the girl's eyes. "Because they know. Both of them. The widow and that man. Linton. They know I saw the papers, and I'm afraid. Last night when the sword was put in my hands, I swear it wasn't an accident. Someone wanted to silence me." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Courage, child. You did the right thing, and you are not alone now." The maid sobbed softly, then glanced around again. "Please don't tell them it was me who kept the fragment. Promise me." Before Miss Marple could answer, a sharp sound carried across the graveyard the snap of a twig. Deliberate, close. Both women froze. "Who's there?" the maid whispered, panic rising in her voice. The shadows yielded no reply, only the faint drip of rain from the branches. Miss Marple turned her head slowly, her eyes searching the dim outlines of stones and trees. She had no doubt someone was listening. "We should return to the vicarage," she said calmly, though her heart quickened. "It is safer there." But the maid shook her head, fearing overwhelming reason. "No, I cannot. They will find me. I must leave Nether Upton. Tonight." She pulled away, running across the graves, her dark figure vanishing into the mist. Miss Marple called softly after her, but the girl did not stop. The sound of her footsteps faded into the distance, leaving only silence once more. Miss Marple remained by the yew tree, the fragment of the letter still in her hand. She was deeply troubled, not only by the maid's terror, but also by the certainty that unseen eyes had watched the entire exchange. At length, she walked back toward the square, her pace steady though her mind churned. Passing the church gate, she nearly collided with Inspector Cray, who looked at her sharply. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Miss Marple," he said gruffly. "We've had reports the maid has disappeared. She's not at the widow's house. not at her lodgings. Miss Marple held his gaze, her voice calm. She came to me, Inspector. She had reason to fear for her life, and she carried evidence that fraud lies at the root of this business. Cray's expression hardened. Fraud, you say, not just murder? Miss Marple nodded. They are often companions, Inspector. And when secrets are threatened with exposure, men and women will go to great lengths to preserve them. Cray muttered under his breath. I'll have. Men search the roads. She can't have gone far. But Miss Marple knew the maid's flight had not been a simple one. Someone had been listening in the churchyard. Someone intent on ensuring the truth remained hidden. Whether the girl escaped or not, the danger had deepened. As she reached her cottage, Miss Marple placed the fragment carefully inside her Bible, among the Psalms. It was safe there for now. She sank into her chair, her thoughts sharp and unsparing. Fraud, she murmured softly. Fraud, murder, silence. Each points to the same hand. The question is, whose hand holds the quill, and whose hand strikes the blow? The rain began again, pattering softly against the windows, as if marking time for the next act in the grim drama unfolding in Nether Upton. The following morning dawned pale and unsettled, a thin fog clinging to the hedgerows as if the village itself were reluctant to reveal too much. Nether Upton carried on with its routine bread deliveries, clattering milk churns, and gossip traded over gates. But beneath it all lay a nervousness, sharpened by the disappearance of the maid. Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts already turning toward Mrs. Colley, a widow, outwardly composed, who dismissed her maid with indecent haste and met in secret with Graham Linton. If fraud and murder were indeed entangled, Mrs. Colley's place within the pattern could not be ignored. By mid-morning, Inspector Cray had the same idea. Miss Marple, walking slowly down the lane, saw him step out of the Colley residence with a look of grim dissatisfaction. "Well?" she asked gently, her hands folded over her handbag. Cray shook his head. Claims she was home the night of the second disturbance. Swears she never left her drawing room. Neighbors saw a light burning, but no one can say she was in it. Convenient, isn't it? Quiet, Miss Marple said softly. And did she speak of her maid? Cray's mouth tightened. Only that the girl was unreliable and dismissed for impertinence. No word of her fears, no mention of the theatre attack. Either she knows more than she admits, or she's a remarkably cold woman. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. Coldness can be armor, Inspector, but armor is often worn when one expects to be struck. She decided then that a direct visit was in order. Later that afternoon, she presented herself at the Colley house, where the maid's absence was obvious in the dust on the hall table and the flowers in the vase beginning to droop. Mrs. Colley received her in the drawing-room, the blinds half drawn, though daylight streamed outside. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and carefully measured. "To what do I owe this visit?" "Only to offer my sympathy once again," Miss Marple replied gently. "And perhaps to keep you company in your loneliness. Grief, I find, is eased by conversation." The widow inclined her head but did not smile. "Conversation often leads to gossip, and gossip I can ill afford." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Gossip, my dear, is often no more than truth seen from a different angle." For a moment, the silence deepened, broken only by the tick of the mantel clock. Then Mrs. Colley spoke with sudden bitterness. "Hubert lived his life by gossip. He thrived on knowing other people's missteps and their secrets. He kept records, letters, contracts, and evidence of things best forgotten. He said it gave him power." Miss Marple nodded, her tone mild. "And did you share in that power?" The widow stiffened. "I endured it. Do not mistake that for sharing." There was a pause, then Miss Marple asked in the same gentle voice, "And the night of the second performance, did you truly remain here alone?" Mrs. Colley's eyes flickered. "Of course. Where else should I have been?" Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, with a gentleman at the inn. A gentleman who once knew your husband and who now seems deeply entangled in his affairs. A sharp intake of breath broke the widow's composure. You presume too much, Miss Marple. I observed, came the reply, calm and steady. And I cannot help but observe that you left the theatre with remarkable speed after your husband's collapse. Nor could I help but notice your presence at the inn only last night. Mrs. Colley rose abruptly, her face pale. You know nothing of my reasons. On the contrary, Miss Marple said kindly. I know that fear often makes us flee when we most wish to stay, and I know that secrets weigh heaviest on those who pretend they carry none. The widow's hands trembled as she adjusted her veil. I cannot speak. It would ruin everything. Miss Marple's voice softened. My dear, silence rarely saves. It only delays the reckoning. The truth always emerges, sometimes through letters, sometimes through careless words, and sometimes through the persistence of an old woman who listens more than she speaks. Mrs. Colley looked away, her shoulders sagging. For an instant, it seemed she might confess, but then her expression hardened once more. I'm sorry, Miss Marple. I cannot help you. Please leave me. Miss Marple obeyed, rising with quiet dignity. As she stepped into the hall, she noticed something the maid had left behind. A glove, tucked beneath the corner of the stair carpet. Miss Marple bent as if to straighten her shawl and retrieved it. A small stain marked the glove ink, dark and unmistakable. She slipped it into her bag, her face betraying nothing. Back in the lane, Inspector Cray was waiting. Well, he asked. She's frightened, Miss Marple said softly. But not of widowhood, of something far older and far deeper. And the truth, Inspector, is never far from ink. Cray frowned at her words, but Miss Marple walked on, her pace unhurried, her eyes thoughtful. She now held more than suspicion. She held proof that the widow's story, like her alibi, was stained by deceit. And as the church bells marked the evening hour, Miss Marple knew the next revelation would not come through gentle questioning, but through exposure of the hidden fraud that bound them all together. The discovery of the ink-stained glove weighed heavily in Miss Marple's handbag as she walked home through the fading light. Each small clue, when viewed alone, seemed trivial, but together they formed the outline of something undeniable. Ink on the glove, ink on the stranger's fingers, ink on the torn scraps of paper, and always Hubert Colley at the center, a man who had hoarded secrets as if they were currency. The next morning brought new urgency. Inspector Cray appeared at Miss Marple's gate, his face lined with frustration. He's gone, he announced without preamble. Mr. Linton, she asked quietly. Cray nodded. Left the King's Arms in the dead of night. Took a train before we could stop him. Left no address, no message. Vanished. Miss Marple tilted her head. A man does not flee unless he fears pursuit, Inspector. And fear, in my experience, is the surest sign of guilt. Cray scowled. Perhaps, but guilt of what? Murder? Blackmail? Or this so-called fraud you keep hinting at? I need more than suspicion. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Then perhaps we must look more closely at what Hubert Colley knew. A solicitor's papers tell more than his tongue ever did. By noon, they stood together in Colley's study, a room lined with books and heavy with the smell of stale ink. The desk drawers had been rifled, with many documents missing, but Miss Marple's patient eyes settled on a locked cabinet in the corner. Cray forced it open with little ceremony, and out spilled bundles of correspondence tied in neat bundles. They worked through them slowly. Letters of business, accounts, and legal drafts until Miss Marple found what she had been expecting. A series of ledgers, carefully kept, showing transactions that were not meant for public eyes. Forgery, she said softly, her finger tracing the neat but unmistakable alterations. Signatures copied, sums adjusted. land sales that never truly happened. Cray frowned, studying the pages. Colley was involved? Miss Marple shook her head gently. Not involved. He had discovered it. See here the notes in his own hand. He was gathering evidence, preparing to expose someone. Cray's brows drew together. And that someone is Linton. Her voice was calm. It seems so. But notice, Inspector, how often Mrs. Colley's name appears in these accounts. Payments made to her father's estate. Funds transferred under her husband's authority. She may not have wielded the pen, but she certainly benefited. Cray muttered an oath. So Colley discovered his wife's family fraud, and Linton was the accomplice. That would explain the missing envelope. He must have meant to confront them both. Miss Marple closed the ledger carefully, and it would explain why he died the night he held that envelope in his hands. Silence filled the study. Outside, the bells tolled the hour, their sound drifting through the open window like a reminder of time running out. Cray broke the silence with a growl. We'll arrest her. Bring her in and see if she can explain these accounts. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his arm. Patience, Inspector. A frightened woman may deny what she cannot escape. Better to let her think herself unobserved. Watch her, and she will reveal more than questioning ever could. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned discreetly to the churchyard, where the maid had vanished 2 nights before. She half hoped to see the girl again, but instead she found another clue. Beneath the yew tree, half buried in the damp soil, lay a torn corner of the cream envelope. On it was written a single name, Edmund Linton. She folded the scrap into her handbag, her eyes thoughtful. The parish records had told her that name belonged to a child baptized here decades ago. The man calling himself Graham Linton was, in truth, returning to the scene of an old disgrace. By evening, the village hummed with fresh gossip. Mrs. Phelps declared the widow was planning to leave for Bath. The innkeeper's wife swore she had seen Mrs. Colley and Linton together before his disappearance, and the butcher's boy insisted he had overheard talk of money owed, money hidden. Miss Marple listened to it all, sitting by her fire with her knitting in her lap. The pattern has become clear now. Fraud had tied Linton and Mrs. Colley together. Hubert Colley had sought to expose them, and the envelope had carried the proof. Murder had silenced him, and fear had driven the maid into hiding. But one question remained, sharp and unresolved. Who had struck the final blow? Linton, the man with ink-stained fingers, or the widow, silent and composed, her life built upon secrets? Miss Marple set down her knitting, her eyes narrowing. Fraud explains motive, she murmured. But motive alone does not reveal the hand that kills. And that hand, I think, is nearer than the inspector yet imagines. Outside, the night settled heavily over Nether Upton, cloaking the village in stillness. But within that stillness, the truth waited, ready to step into the light. Neither Upton woke the next day to a sense of expectancy, though none could have said why. The market square bustled. The church bell tolled the quarter hours, and yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of village life there was a feeling that something was about to break. Miss Marple, sitting quietly at her cottage table, was the one who intended that it should. The threads had gathered the fraud uncovered in Hubert Colley's papers, the torn envelope bearing Edmund Linton's name, the widow's evasions, and the maid's terrified flight. Now they needed only to be drawn together in a single knot. She began her day as any old lady might, by paying visits. To Mrs. Phelps she inquired after knitting wool. To the innkeeper's wife she ordered a half-pound of tea. Yet in each conversation she allowed just enough of her mild observations to slip out. So curious, she mused to Mrs. Brant at the King's Arms, that a man of business should leave so hurriedly without his accounts in order. And to Mrs. Phelps, one wonders, don't you think, why a widow would plan a journey when her affairs here are unsettled? By evening, those remarks had travelled through the entire village. It was an old trick, but an effective one. Gossip was the net that would draw both the widow and Linton back into view. At dusk, Inspector Cray arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, summoned by a note she had sent earlier. He looked weary, but watchful. "Well, Miss Marple, you promised me progress. What do you have in mind?" She poured him a cup of tea before replying. "The truth, Inspector, is a timid creature. It seldom shows itself under harsh questioning. But set the stage correctly, and it will walk into the light of its own accord." Cray frowned. "You mean to set a trap?" "A gathering," she corrected gently. "One where all interested parties may be present, for I find people betray themselves most easily when they believe they are hidden among others." Cray muttered, but agreed. "Where?" "The theatre, of course," Miss Marple replied. "It began there. It must end there. Announce that further inquiries require all who knew Mr. Colley to attend." The widow will not refuse her composure. It demands she face the whispers. And Mr. Linton, wherever he has gone, will be drawn back. He cannot resist knowing what others suspect. And so it was arranged. Notices went quietly around the village. By the following evening, the theatre once again opened its doors, not for a play, but for a gathering. The seats filled with villagers, whispering among themselves, their curiosity burning brighter than the lamps. On the stage, Inspector Cray stood stern and imposing. Beside him, small and serene in her pale shawl, sat Miss Marple. One by one the key figures arrived. Mrs. Colley, veiled and composed, her back straight as a rod. And then, when some had begun to think he would not dare, Graham Linton appeared, slipping in at the side and taking a place with forced calm. His eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of unease. The murmurs swelled, then hushed as Cray raised his hand. "We are here to shed light on the death of Hubert Colley. There are questions of fraud, of missing documents, and of threats unfulfilled. All must be answered." Miss Marple's voice followed, gentle yet carrying across the hall. "We do not seek to accuse without cause. But truth has a way of pressing through, like grass between stones, and tonight we shall see where it grows." The widow stirred uneasily. Linton's jaw tightened. The audience, sensing drama, leaned forward eagerly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly as she looked from one to the other. There is no need to rush. The truth will reveal itself in gesture, in glance, and in word. All that remains is to watch and listen. Her tone was calm, but within it was a quiet certainty. She had set the stage. The trap was ready. And before the night ended, she knew one among them would no longer be able to keep silent. As the lamps flickered and the theatre hushed once more, Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and thought, "The final act is about to begin." The theatre was hushed in a way no performance could ever manage. The seats creaked as villagers shifted, their faces half lit by the lamps that glowed against the velvet curtains. There was no stage scenery, no actors tonight, only the raw expectancy of truth. Inspector Cray stood stiffly at the front, his hands clasped behind his back. He had the look of a man who preferred evidence to performance, yet even he understood that this was theatre of another kind. Beside him, Miss Marple sat serenely, her knitting in her lap, though she had no intention of lifting the needles. Her presence seemed harmless and grandmotherly, but those who knew her better recognized that it was she who held the reins of the evening. The widow was seated to one side, veiled but upright, her composure as carefully arranged as her black dress. Graham Linton, across from her, sat with his arms folded, the faintest smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, as though he thought himself impervious to suspicion. Between them stretched a silence that was sharper than any accusation. Miss Marple was the first to speak, her tone gentle yet clear. "We are here, my friends, because a man died in this very hall not many nights ago. Hubert Colley, a man who prided himself on knowledge, left behind a folded program and a fragment of paper. That fragment bore the word murder. We must ask ourselves why. A murmur ran through the crowd, quickly hushed as she continued. "You see," Miss Marple went on, "Mr. Colley was not only a solicitor, he was a keeper of records. He discovered things, and what he discovered this time was not merely unkind gossip, but fraud, deliberate fraud in land accounts, fraud that touched upon names we know well." Inspector Cray held up one of the ledgers from Colley's study. "These records show money passing through false signatures and estates wrongly sold. The names Linton and Colley appear more than once." At this, Mrs. Colley shifted in her seat, though she said nothing. Linton leaned forward, his voice steady, baseless. Old notes and scribbles proved nothing. The man was delusional in his last days. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled softly, though her voice remained mild. "And yet, Mr. Linton, your name appears also in the parish records. Edmund Linton was baptized here many years ago. You're not a stranger to Nether Upton at all. You are one of its own, returning under another guise." The audience stirred again, whispers rippling through the hall. Linton's smirk faltered. "A name means little. Families move. Children are born. None of this makes me guilty of anything." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple agreed. "But guilt has a way of speaking when silence would serve better." She turned her gaze gently upon the widow. "And you, Mrs. Colley, you dismissed your maid without warning, though she carried knowledge that frightened her. She confided in me. She told me she had been ordered to burn your husband's papers, but she did not burn them all." The widow's gloved hands tightened in her lap. "The girl was unreliable," she said quickly. "She imagined threats where none existed." Miss Marple shook her head. "She imagined nothing. I hold here a piece of the envelope she hid away, bearing a warning, 'They will kill again if this is known.' You see, the fraud was not only in business. It was bound up in lives, in reputation. Mr. Colley threatened to expose it, and so he was silenced." Linton rose suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is absurd. You cannot stand here with gossip and scraps of paper and call it truth." But as he spoke, all eyes turned to him. His voice had risen, his calmness fractured. Even the widow glanced at him sharply, as though seeing an ally become a liability. Miss Marple's voice cut through the tension with quiet firmness. "It is not scraps of paper that condemn, Mr. Linton. It is behavior. You fled the inn before dawn. You sought secret meetings with the widow. You carried papers on your person even as you pretended to rest. And above all, you could not resist returning here tonight, drawn to see if suspicion might yet miss its mark." Linton's hands clenched, his face pale beneath the lamps. The villagers watched in a silence heavy with anticipation. The widow suddenly stood, her voice trembling but resolute. "Enough. I will not be sacrificed. Hubert found the records, but it was Linton who forged them, Linton who pressed me into his schemes. My only crime was silence." Linton turned on her, his anger no longer concealed. "You were eager enough to take the money. Don't paint yourself the victim now." The theatre erupted in gasps. Inspector Cray barked for order, but the truth had already broken free. Their quarrel, their accusations, revealed more than any direct question could. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting untouched, watching the unraveling she had known would come. She leaned toward the inspector and said softly, "The final act, you see, writes itself." Cray gave a grim nod, and the curtain is about to fall. The theatre had grown so silent that the faint creak of the lamps overhead seemed deafening. Villagers leaned forward in their seats, caught between fear and fascination. Inspector Cray stood grim-faced, his constables ready should tempers turn violent. On one side of the stage, Mrs. Colley trembled behind her veil. On the other, Graham Linton's fists were clenched tightly at his sides, his composure shattered by the widow's betrayal. It was Miss Marple who spoke first, her voice calm, even gentle, as though addressing children rather than suspects. "You see, my friends, This is no longer a matter of suspicion. The pattern is complete, and once a pattern is clear, it cannot be unseen. Her pale eyes rested on Linton. Mr. Linton returned to Nether Upton not by chance, but because Hubert Colley uncovered his past. He was Edmund Linton, son of a family disgraced by fraud many years ago. He remade himself as a clerk in London, but the temptation to repeat the sins of the past was too great. He began forging papers, altering accounts, and transferring sums to estates where they were never due. A murmur rippled through the hall. Linton straightened, his jaw set. "You have no proof?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "On the contrary, the proof lies in Hubert Colley's papers. He had gathered the documents into a sealed envelope, intending to expose both you and those who benefited. He confronted you with it the night of the performance, and so, before the second act, you pressed a note into his hand, a warning written in your ink-stained fingers. That is why the folded program contained a fragment of the letter, the word murder, etched as a grim signal of what was to come." Gasps sounded, and Miss Marple let the silence settle before turning her gaze to the widow. "But you, Mrs. Colley, are not free of blame. Your family's estate profited from those false transactions. You dismissed your maid not because she was impertinent, but because she knew too much. She saw you order the burning of your husband's papers. You thought, by destroying them, the truth would remain hidden." The widow's shoulders sagged, her hands twisting in her lap. "I did not kill him," she whispered. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "I do not believe you did. You feared disgrace, you feared ruin, but you lacked the will for violence. Your guilt is silence, not murder." All eyes turned again to Linton. Miss Marple's voice sharpened, quiet yet cutting. "It was you who slipped poison into Colley's glass at the theatre. A subtle draught, easy to administer in the crowded stalls. You ensured his death would seem like sudden heart failure. Nothing more. And when suspicion lingered, you attempted a second act, forcing the stage sword into the usher's hand, hoping to cast the blame elsewhere and divert attention. The usher, pale but resolute, cried out, 'It was him!' I smelled the ink. He was close behind me." Inspector Cray stepped forward, his voice thunderous. "Graham Linton, you're under arrest for the murder of Hubert Colley." But Linton did not move easily. His eyes swept the hall with a mixture of fury and desperation. "He would have ruined me," he shouted. He meddled where he had no right. All my work, all my chances, he would have dragged them into the mud. He left me no choice. The villagers recoiled at his outburst. Mrs. Colley let out a stifled cry, pressing her veil to her face, and in that moment the truth was laid bare, for all ambition and fear had led to murder, and secrecy had drawn others into its shadow. Miss Marple rose slowly to her feet, her shawl slipping gently from her shoulders. "There is always a choice, Mr. Linton," she said softly. "Murder is never forced upon us. It is chosen, and the choice leaves a stain that no amount of ink can hide." Linton was seized by the constables, his protests echoing hollowly in the vaulted ceiling of the theatre. The widow collapsed back into her seat, silent tears staining her veil. The audience, who had come in curiosity, now sat stunned in the knowledge that their village had harbored both fraud and murder. Inspector Cray turned to Miss Marple, his voice rough with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "You saw it all, even when the rest of us refused to look." She smiled faintly, her eyes kind. "Not seen, Inspector. Only listened. People will always tell you what you need to know if you give them the silence in which to speak." The lamps flickered as the constables led Linton away. Outside, the night was still. The rain had finally ceased, leaving the cobbles glistening under the moonlight. Within the theatre, villagers began to rise slowly, their whispers filling the silence once more. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The curtain had fallen on the performance, but the echoes of truth would linger long after the lamps were dimmed. She knew that tomorrow, Nether Upton would resume its routines of bread and milk, gossip and tidiness. Yet none would forget the night when theatre gave way to reality, and a quiet old woman revealed the murderer among them. She rose at last, her voice almost a whisper as she turned to the inspector. "The play has ended. Only the aftermath remains." Morning came to Nether Upton with deceptive brightness, as if the village wished to scrub away the memory of the night before. Shop doors opened, milk churns clattered, and the baker's boy whistled down the lane as though nothing had changed. Yet beneath the cheerful surface, everyone knew that Nether Upton had been altered forever. The truth had stepped into the light, and it left shadows no daylight could quite dispel. Inspector Cray, though triumphant in the arrest of Graham Linton, found himself restless. He spent much of the morning pacing the square, answering the endless questions of villagers. Yes, it was fraud as well as murder, he repeated more times than he could count. No, Mrs. Colley is not charged, though her silence aided him. His bluntness left some satisfied, others whispering that justice had only been half served. Mrs. Colley herself did not leave her house. Curtains remained drawn, the gate unlatched but untouched. Some villagers spoke harshly of her. "She must have known," declared Mrs. Phelps with relish, while others allowed that grief could make a woman retreat into the shadows. Yet whether pity or scorn, she had become an object of conversation rather than sympathy. As for the maid, no one had yet seen her return. Rumours ran wild. Some said she had fled to London, others that she had been spirited away. Miss Marple, however, knew better. She had received a note early that morning, pushed beneath her door. It was written in a shaky hand, but its meaning was clear. "Safe with cousins. Will not return. Thank you." Miss Marple folded the note carefully into her sewing basket. The girl had chosen freedom over fear, and for that Miss Marple was quietly glad. By afternoon, the village had settled into a kind of uneasy rhythm. At the tea shop, customers leaned close across their cups, replaying the events of the theatre. At the post office, the clerk solemnly declared that he had always mistrusted strangers with ink on their fingers. And at the King's Arms, Mrs. Brant swore she would never again let a guest keep papers under his pillow. Through it all, Miss Marple moved quietly, as she always did, her shawl drawn neatly about her shoulders. She received nods of respect, but also looks of wary admiration. The villagers had seen how she had unravelled a mystery that confounded others, and they were not certain whether to feel reassured or unsettled. For what else might she know, simply by watching? In the evening, she sat once more by her fire, her knitting resting in her lap. Inspector Cray stopped by, as was becoming his habit. He looked more at ease than he had in days, though the lines of weariness still marked his face. "You were right from the start," he admitted grudgingly. "While I was chasing shadows, you were listening to whispers. I'll not underestimate you again, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "Oh, I should hope you never underestimated me, Inspector. I'm merely an old woman who has lived long enough to see how people repeat themselves. Human nature does not change, however much we might wish it to." Cray grunted, half in agreement, half in resignation. "Still, I'll take a clean confession over human nature any day. Makes my work simpler." Miss Marple poured him a modest cup of tea, her eyes twinkling. "Ah, but simplicity is a rare luxury, Inspector. Life insists on being complicated, and people most of all. That is why we must watch not only what they say, but also what they do when they believe no one is looking." Cray raised his cup in reluctant salute. "You've got the better of me there." When he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, though her hands were still for a long while. Her mind replayed the pieces of the case. The folded program, the missing envelope, the widow's silence, and the stranger's ink-stained fingers. Each had been small, almost invisible, yet together they had spelled out death. At last, she set her knitting aside and looked toward the window, where the evening light cast long shadows across the village. A dog barked in the distance, a cart rattled along the lane, and life, stubborn as ever, went on. She whispered softly, as though speaking only to herself, "Murder will come even to the most peaceful of places. It slips in, quiet as ink on paper, and once written, it cannot be erased." The fire crackled, the shadows deepened, and Nether Upton settled into uneasy quiet. The curtain had fallen on Hubert Colley's final act, but the memory of it would linger, whispered in drawing-rooms and shop queues for years to come. And in her cottage, Miss Marple sat serene, knowing she had once again seen through to the heart of human nature.